Welcome back to Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay, and we're joined again in the studio with Troy LaRaviere. He's the president of the Chicago Principals and Administrators Association. He was removed from his job as principal at Blaine Elementary School for speaking out against Mayor Rahm Emanuel's policy with Chicago Public Schools. He's now exploring a run for mayor himself. Thanks for joining us again.
Yes, sir.
So we've been talking about your history, Chicago schools. Let's kind of go a little bigger picture in terms of schools. How would you characterize Rahm Emanuel's overall strategy for schools in Chicago, and what would you do differently?
So I have an understanding now that I did not have when Emanuel first ran. When he ran for office the first time, I would have voted for him. He seemed like just as appealing an option as anyone else. I had no idea what was in store for us. I remember him getting a lot of money from banks. I remember them talking about the California Hollywood connections, and I thought, wow, those people must really love and trust that man.
Well,
to be
Rahm
giving
Emanuel
him so much
is
money.
pretty identified with Barack Obama, who's from more or less from Chicago.
What I did not realize is that the money that the bankers and the investors were pouring into his campaign, that was not a donation. It was an investment, and that they expected a return on their investment. And that's what Chicago Public Schools is, to get back to your question, to this mayor. It is a return on the investment of the people who donated to their campaign. They expect something in return.
What are they getting?
And so, for example, I think I mentioned in one of the previous segments, Sodexo Magic, a custodial management company. Aramark, another custodial management company, got a multi-million dollar, hundreds of millions of CPS dollars to manage custodial operations. The principals have said, by far, their schools are in the worst condition that they've ever been in. But he gave them hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts.
That used to be directly done through the public sector?
Exactly.
So this is part of the whole privatization strategy.
Right. But they're getting hundreds of millions of dollars, and then right after he gave Sodexo Magic a contract, one of their top investors turned around and gave him $250,000 in campaign contributions. He takes out his whole strategy for running the city and the school system is to borrow at extremely high. The rates are so high, the common term for them in Chicago is now payday loans, that he takes out payday loans to run the city and run the school system. Well, who pays those payday loans back? Who pays the interest on that? We are. The taxpayers are going to pay the interest on that.
I'm assuming his argument is he can't get cheaper money.
He can generate revenue. Right? He can generate, when he came in, we had something called a corporate head tax in Chicago, where businesses, in order to tax them fairly, they needed a way to figure out how to tax them based on their size. And you can't go with profit margins because you can play with that. One of the things you can't play with is the number of employees that you have. And so the head tax was a per employee tax that enabled the city to tax a corporation based on how large it was. One of Emanuel's first acts when he came in was to get rid of that tax and then raise our property taxes. And so instead of generating revenue, he took away revenue. Am I making sense here? There's also a LaSalle Street.
Well, getting rid of the corporate head tax.
Right, by getting rid of the corporate head tax.
Gained revenue through increased property taxes.
But he did not do that. He did not do that immediately, right? What he did was he got rid of the corporate head tax and then began to borrow and borrow and borrow and borrow, and waited until after he was reelected to then raise property taxes. If he had raised them before, when the revenue was needed, he would not have had to borrow as much, and we would not be stuck paying the bill for all he borrowed. And so it was a very cowardly move in that he did not want to face the public and say, we need to generate revenue before the election. And so he put himself in a position to have to raise property taxes more than he would have otherwise had to do, because he had generated all of these interest payments that would not have been necessary if the property taxes would have been raised beforehand, and he would not have had to have raised them as much. And so he sacrificed our future income as a political strategy for not having to accept the responsibility for raising taxes until after an election. Everyone knew they had to be raised. He just wasn't willing to do it until he was safely in office again for another 4 years. And as a result of that, we have 3 years of additional interest payments on the loans he took out.
Well, the argument Emanuel gives and others is that the schools in a lot of many major American cities, the inner city schools, were quote unquote failing. Test scores were terrible. Kids weren't learning to read and write. I think the number, the last time I saw this, Americans, over 30% are functionally illiterate, and that this privatization was needed to break up the inertia of the schools and all that. So what do you make of that argument?
So it's a completely false argument. A 2007 study revealed, and another study that just backed it up, it was replicated, that Chicago public schools do better than any other school district in the state with the same kids. What that means is that if you are a poor child, there is nowhere in the state of Illinois that you learn more than in a Chicago public school. If you are a middle class child, there is nowhere in the state of Illinois that you learn more than in a Chicago public school. If you are an upper class child from a high income background, you on average perform higher than upper class children in any other school district in the state. And so what Chicago public schools does, and its teachers do, is teach and help kids to grow better than any other school district. The way they're able to pin this failing schools argument on us is because we have more of those low-income kids than the average school district. So the average performance of a child who is low income is pretty low compared to the others. In Chicago public schools, our low income kids do better than any other place, but we have so many of them that our average is lower than those other places. Am I making sense here? Yeah. And so the question is, I used to be an assistant principal at, I told you in the previous segment, a high poverty school, Johnson on the west side of North Lawndale. After being an assistant principal at Johnson, I went on to become a principal at one of the most affluent schools in the district, Blaine, in the Lakeview community, one of the richest in the city. Now, when my kids came to Blaine, they were 2 years ahead, on average, in kindergarten than the kids at Johnson. So the kids at Johnson are starting school on day one of kindergarten.
All right.
A year behind. Let me make the point that how can Johnson be a failing school if the kids start behind on day one? They have been failed long before they ever reached the school system. They've been failed by their aldermen, their city councilmen, failed by their state rep, failed by their state senator, failed by their mayor, failed by their congressman, failed by the business community that didn't create the kind of job their parents would have needed to have the kind of income to expose them to things that stimulate their cognitive development the way those kids in Lakeview got theirs stimulated. And so there is a complete failure to get these kids what they need from birth to the day they enter school, right? And somebody has to be held accountable for that failure. It is my belief that we should test kids on day one of kindergarten. And based on the score they get, based on how far ahead or behind they are, that we give a grade, but not to the school. We give a grade to that state rep. We give a grade to that state senator. We give a grade to the mayor of the city that allowed these kids to show up so far behind. We give a grade to the alderman or the city councilman. We give a grade to the business community and the Chamber of Commerce for producing a situation that leads to these kids showing up 2 years behind the kids in another community. Am I making sense here? Yeah. And so the failing schools argument is false on so many levels. I talked about how it's false on the level of CPS does better, Chicago Public Schools does better than any other district in the state when you look at similar kinds of students. And I talked about the fact that kids show up on day one behind. And the people who are, and so they've been failed on day one, but the people who are responsible for that failure are not held accountable. Even if you say the parents are responsible for that failure, what do we as a city and a community do for those parents to make sure that those kids get what they need no matter what household they're born into? It still falls back on us.
Okay, so let's say, when's the next election?
It is 2019.
2019. Let's say you're mayor. What do?
You invest, right? You do two things. You invest in communities, and you do so based on what the research says works. You don't invest based on ideology, right? This current administration has an ideology-based approach. It is this neoliberal, the corporate sector is going to take care of everything. We give them tax breaks, somehow it's going to trickle down to the poor. We put schools in competition with one another, and that's going to, with all of these things have absolutely no evidence base whatsoever to support them. In fact, the evidence says the opposite. And so when I became a principal, for example, it's a perfect example. You know, I don't know every aspect of running the school. I'm not an expert in every aspect. I know teacher professional development, I can do that. I didn't know special ed. I didn't know a lot of the socio-emotional stuff. I didn't know a lot about budgeting, but I got good people in who do know, and we looked at what the evidence says works in each one of those areas. You know, in Blaine, I mentioned, we took achievement from 79% to 89%. We went from the number 4 neighborhood school in the district to the number 1 neighborhood school in the district. I wish I could say I came in and did all this innovative stuff, right? And that's why we were so innovative. But that's not what happened. What happened is we did what the research says worked. That's what we did. Like, the evidence of what works in education is out there. We just had to have the political courage to actually do it, right? And it's the same I think it's the same in any aspect of city government. You find out what works, number one, and you commit to do it. Number two, you invest. Every time you have a goal, you have to invest something in reaching that goal, or invest something in the strategy that you have toward reaching that goal. So it's evidence-based, research-based practice in whatever field of endeavor you have, and then there's investing in every community. Go ahead.
Well, I would think one of the things one would want to invest in is pre-K. If kids are not showing up at the same level in kindergarten, we know they're not. And we know, given class background and different opportunities, even pre-K isn't going to solve it, but I would think it would go a long way towards it. But whether it's mandatory or at least available pre-K for every kid, a better, as you said, ratio between students and licensed professionals in the schools.
Decent staff.
In the end, it comes down to a battle over money.
That's right.
So
what are these kids worth? That's what it comes down to.
So how do you wage that battle? As mayor, what are you going to do?
So I think you have to convince people. One, you have to turn around the narrative about these failing schools, right? In the end, you have to convince the public, the residents of Chicago, that the school system, of what the school system can do. There's been a narrative put out there about what it can't do, and the narrative is completely false. If you want people to invest in something, people don't invest in what they don't believe in, right? If you don't invest, you don't believe, right? You invest in the things you believe in. And so the new administration has to begin to create a different narrative, has to begin to cite the kind of things that I just cited, but do so repeatedly and relentlessly, that our school system is the best school system in the state when it comes to helping students of particular backgrounds grow intellectually and academically when compared to the same students of other backgrounds. You have to repeat that talking point relentlessly. When Rahm Emanuel came into office, for example, he wanted to lengthen the school day, and he had a talking point that went along with it, right, about negative performance. And Chicago has, everybody in Chicago knows this talking point. Chicago has the shortest school day in the country. It's not even true, but it got repeated so often that he was able to convince the public to buy into the lengthening of the school day. And so it's a good strategy toward a goal that was questionable. The strategy of convincing the public that something is doable, that it is possible, and that it will generate good results for our system has to be done. But we have to do it in relationship to strategies that have actually been proven to work, and not ideologically based strategies that are not going to make any difference whatsoever.
But as you said earlier, Rahm Emanuel's policies are very linked to privatization. They're very linked to a lot of people who make campaign contributions, wanting something as return on their investment, as you've said. So to increase revenues and move away from that privatization, which I'm assuming you're advocating,
Right.
That's a war. That's a big battle.
Right.
So
the public opinion war.
It's a public opinion war, but it's also a policy war. Like, what kind of policies would you advocate for raising revenue?
So I just mentioned the corporate head tax is one possibility.
How much did that raise?
If I remember correctly, it was about 60 million, but it all depends on what you set it at. What's the per head tax? But it's not the only one. Particularly, I'm more interested in policies that make things fair. So, for example, a study just came out by the Chicago Tribune that showed that the Cook County property tax system, and Chicago is a part of Cook County, is heavily weighted in favor of those who are wealthy, and that the poor and that the working class of Chicago pay an inordinate, an unbalanced portion of their income toward property taxes. That is, the system is weighted against them. And so I think any new revenue has to take that into account and balance that picture out so that those who are more capable pay their fair share. And so there are plenty of ideas. There's the LaSalle Street tax. LaSalle Street is a street in Chicago where a lot of the exchanges and the commercial industries are located. And so the LaSalle Street tax, which is a tax on financial transaction, is one possibility. I believe in Seattle, I just heard about generating revenue through an income tax, but that's only leveled on folks who have above 250,000 or 500,000. I can't remember what the number is.
They're doing something similar in San Francisco with a land transfer tax on more expensive houses.
I'm not pushing any of these taxes in particular, but each one of them is an example of the kind of creative thinking we can do to generate revenue that is needed so that we can invest in every community and ensure that the people in those communities and the communities themselves get to have the investments they need to realize their potential, right? Those kids in North Lawndale who end up shooting each other, those kids who show up to school a year behind, when they were born, right, they weren't a year behind, right? When they were born, those kids in North Lawndale and those kids in Lakeview were on a level playing field. The capacity of these kids to learn was no different than the capacity. Now, maybe some individuals within these groups had differences and individuals between the groups were different, but when you look at the collective capacity of those children, it's the same. But they grow up in a city that invests far less in this group of kids than they do in this group of kids. And as a result, they don't get to realize their potential. They're robbed, their communities are robbed as a result, and Chicago is robbed as a result. And we have to convince a critical mass of the residents and those in the business community that investing in these kids, just as much as these kids, is good for us all. And so that's part of that war you talked about, right? And I think the war is winnable.
Okay, in the next segment of the interview, we're going to talk about the fight inside the Democratic Party, because the fight in Chicago to change the school policy and other issues that are facing the city in terms of social justice and equality is a fight against a Democratic Party machine that runs the city. So join us for the next segment on Reality Asserts Itself with Troy LaRaviere on the Real News Network.